All right, ladies and gentlemen, so good late morning. We stand between you and I guess whatever your lunch plans are. For those who have actually signed up, there is an industry lunch, and Boeing will be talking about some of their, have been sponsoring that lunch, and we'll have Congresswoman Kendra Horn actually speaking, so that should be an interesting discussion. So what we're going to do now is go quickly through, I like how this panel has been phrased, a grand tour of global space policy issues. So as you know, across the elements of our space community, we have technology, we have business, we have policy, and policy is a very important element at the national level as well as the global international level. And so our moderator for this illustrious panel is going to be Brian Whedon, who is the Director of Program Planning for Secure World Foundation. For many of you know, both at the national US level as well as the global international level, Brian has been a very active contributor to various space policy and security issues. He has a background actually in the US Air Force, and I just really appreciate a lot of the things that he does and writes about. So Brian, I will turn it over to you, ladies and gentlemen, and take away your panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, good morning, everyone. I think it still is morning for a few more minutes. Welcome to this morning's panel discussion of a grand tour of space policy issues. So what do we mean by that? Well, if you're a fan of cars, you might have heard the term GT, which is short for grand touring. And that historically means a car that's equipped to go long distances at high speed and leisure and comfort. And that's what I think we're going to aim for today. We plan to cover quite a bit of distance with several different big issues that we're dealing with in the space policy world, global issues. And we're going to touch on them. We're going to kind of hit the high points. And hopefully, while you guys are all remaining comfortable, maybe not my panelists up here, but at least in the audience, hopefully are comfortable as we go through this tour. So just to briefly get started, what do we mean when we say space policy? Well, public policy is the how, why, and to what effect governments decide to do something about a particular problem. In some cases, they might decide to have a new budget item, or they might decide to launch a new program, or in some cases, they might decide to do nothing at all. The public policy is then the process and the debate of how you address all these big problems. Why is this an issue for industry? Well, government plays a big role in space through setting national policy, establishing regulations, serving as a customer in various markets. And industry is an important stakeholder in these discussions of policy because they're affected by policy, they're affected by these decisions. And so one of the things that we're going to try and highlight on this panel is the role that industry is playing in raising awareness about these issues and also their perspective on the space policy issues. So just a quick introduction of my panelists. I will start from that other end. We have Jennifer Warren. She's the Vice President of Technology Policy and Regulation at Lockheed Martin. Sitting next to her is Kayui Schrogel. He's the President of the International Institute of Space Law. It's followed by Marco Fuchs. He's the CEO of OHB System AG. And then Pierre Deslos. He's the Deputy Director General at the European Commission Directorate General for the Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship, and SMCs. And last, sitting next to me is Bill Beckman. He's the Director for NASA Programs at Boeing. We've identified 5 topics today that we're going to try and go through. They are radiofrequency spectrum management, orbital space debris, space traffic management, space resource utilization, and national security space. We're going to go through those. I've asked each of my panelists to sort of have some opening comments to kind of set the stage, but we're also going to be taking questions from the audience on this. We're going to be using the Slido tool. If you're familiar with it, be using it several times during this conference. There's going to be, on the outer 2 panels, are going to be instructions on how to use Slido. If you go there, you can submit questions, and we'll be incorporating them into our discussions. So, to get us started, Jennifer, our first topic on our tour is going to be spectrum. What do we mean when we say spectrum management? Can you give a brief overview, and what are the big issues that we're talking about?
Great, thank you, Brian, and thank you for having me today. Good morning, everyone. So spectrum management, it's really about management of a critical resource. And unlike many other aspects of space, it's a resource that's utilized by other sectors of the economy. So there's competition for access to this resource. There's congestion in the use of the resource, depending upon what part of it we're talking about. But spectrum is that which makes everything in space, from low Earth orbit to deep space, be able to communicate, control things, command and control, et cetera. So it's pretty critical to the future, current and future space economy. But one of the unique things is that, like most things in space, collaboration and cooperation domestically among players, but also internationally, is critically important. This year is a particularly critically important time because we're coming to what's called the World Radio Conference at the International Telecommunications Union. And spectrum is a resource that is not only managed at the national level, but is also the subject of an international treaty, which sets out the rules and guidelines for use of spectrum at the global level. And that guides many national administrations on how to allow use of it. So it's very important that these rules and regulations and spectrum allocations provide not only for the certainty of current space operations, whether it's satellite communications, weather, PNT, but that they also provide for growth and innovation opportunities for space-based applications that we might not even have thought of yet, right? So we're trying to ensure that the space economy of today can continue to grow based on ideas from anywhere in the world. And the ITU, which next week, which is when this World Radio Conference starts, brings together 193 countries to make decisions on this resource. And they make decisions that need to balance, hopefully, national priorities that reflect more than the priorities of perhaps one sector. So how do we balance and make sure that national economic and security priorities reflect, shall we say, a citizen's needs rather than just consumer needs? And I think that's really the shift, because when you look at the space economy serves not only consumers, but citizens in a very transnational way. And so decisions will be made there as to how much spectrum remains viable for certain space-based applications, how much spectrum is studied for future space-based applications, and this is where all of us working together, going to Brian's point about what's the role of industry and governments and agencies that are users of spectrum, so space agencies, how do we all work together to educate the decision makers that will come to this, from the 193 countries, that will come to this treaty conference and make those decisions? That is very important. So there's about 11 items that will be discussed at this upcoming conference, some that will be as immediate as Earth stations in motion in the Ka band. How do we allow that space-based application? To looking at future spectrum allocations for next generation SATCOM. And there's civil and other spectrum decisions that are going to be made as well, but I just want to highlight those two. There's also a future agenda item to look at command and control of UAS by satellite. That's a really exciting one that's garnering a lot of attention. Then there's the more regulatory, non-spectrum based, but still important on how the space economy comes together, and that is, how do the mega constellations, how do the regulations for satellites adapt to the mega constellations so that they're not disadvantaged by the rules, but that the rules accommodate them but still hold them to similar standards to that which apply to the GEOs and the non-mega NGSOs. So that's kind of a beginning of the tour. I'm happy to answer questions, but it's a really critical time for international collaboration and reaching out to your heads of delegations, to those ministries or regulators that are leading the national delegations into the WRC, as well as the commission that is also an observer there. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Pierre, if I could ask you, I mean, for you at the commission, Galileo is an important program. How do you see spectrum Hey, I think we're back.
Does it work? Yes. Yeah, because we mentioned the word Galileo probably is the reason why we were cut off, you see. Because actually it's true also that we had a problem of frequency in the US actually. Because on Galileo, to be very clear, Europeans sometimes we are naive. And we believe that when you have rules, you have to comply with the rules. So we decided some time ago for Galileo that it was needed to obtain authorization from the FCC to have, the appropriate frequency in the US. Others having similar system in the world are not so naive as us, and they have not asked for any authorization. We have done it, and it took us several years before we got an authorization. And honestly, now, more seriously, I'm very pleased that we have done it, because it's important, actually, that we comply with the rules, especially in a country like the US, of course, which is a fundamental country to use a GNSS system. But frequencies are fundamental. And if you don't have the appropriate frequency, it creates a problem. And even with the authorizations that we have got in the US, we will not be able to use the full capabilities of Galileo. With Galileo, we intend to have a system which will basically give us a precision of 20 centimeters everywhere in the world except in the US, unless we get an authorization for this appropriate frequency. So when we talk about frequency, it may sound like a technical problem, something which is difficult to understand for normal people, but in reality, it's fundamental for systems like Galileo, but many other systems too.
And the reason you needed to get that special authorization is there was a US law prohibiting foreign satellite systems from broadcasting into the US, which is why that special thing was needed. And that's an example of some of the I would say legacy regulations or rules that can be impacting how we use spectrum. There's a question from the audience here, and I think Jennifer, you may be able to answer this. And it's basically, how does technical solutions, will those advance, will there be technical advances that negate the need for spectrum management? So things like this, cognitive radio, I'm thinking software-defined radios, maybe also spread spectrum. Will there ever be a time when we're less challenged for spectrum, or do you think that there's always going to be a need to do the management and the scarcity?
So you can see international collaboration taking place right here. Yeah, spectrum sharing. So the ideal would be that spectrum regulators are in fact put out of the business of managing spectrum. What they will morph into is in effect a spectrum interference monitor or enforcement authority, rather than necessarily having to do the traditional management approaches. But we are not close yet to that, where we are still making decisions as to what service has primary use of a band of spectrum, and then how do other services fit into that or get laid over or underlaid to that primary service. There's a lot of experimentation going on, but we are not anywhere close yet to where we've seen a solution that can be broadly applied, a one-size-fits-all technology solution. Oh.
There's one for each. Yeah, just pass it on.
No, there is a one with a green.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to the second topic here, so we can make sure we just touch on all of them, and that's the issue of orbital space debris, which you've probably heard come up other times today, or this week. So Bill, if you could give us just a really quick overview of what this issue is and what are some of the big policy questions.
Great, so the initial comment, short and sweet, space debris is bad, and I'll try to go into a little more depth than that. But approximately we have 40,000 objects in space, and those are satellites, defunct satellites, and different debris that are orbiting right now. And in order to manage that, we've got to track it. We have to give people advance notice to move. And on average, there's probably about 3 satellites a day that have to move in order to avoid some of the debris, to avoid creating even more debris. I think as we move forward, we started off in '57 with 2 satellites, and with that, the advent of space debris. Today, with smaller satellites and the CubeSats, we're launching about 350 to 450 satellites on an annual basis. And so we keep growing. And now there's the advent of what is referred to as the mega constellations. And GPS and things like that are 30 to 60 typically in a constellation. Now we're looking at hundreds and thousands of potential satellites in a single constellation. So instead of having 40,000 objects on orbit, we could have a lot more, like 25 times the amount of active satellites, and probably a 200% increase in objects that you need to track, just because you have to take into allowance the deorbit of some of the satellites after their useful life. So with that, it comes a whole lot more. Is the technology there? Are we ready to be able to track and move that many satellites? And I think with the projected number of satellites, someone put together an estimate that we'd probably have to move satellites and on the average of about 8 times per hour. That's, worldwide, that you'd have to move, 8 satellites in the course of an hour. I kind of ask myself the question, is that really doable? And then I think as you move into other aspects of this, you look at, some of the, concerns out there. And I've got that is, we have different standards for how close is too close, what constitutes when you have to move a bird. Consistent tracking accuracy. So you have commercial fidelity, which is not as finite as the Air Force fidelity. So which information are you going to use to make these decisions? We have the need for secure communication protocols to make sure that if 2 people are on a collision course, that there is definitely secure communication between the 2 of them so that you can take action. I would say that you need traffic rules, who has the right of way as we move into a more congested space. And finally, the disposal. How do you go about doing it, and what are the timelines to do so? So there's a lot of challenges that are present, and I think we're kind of at a good place to revisit the space debris policy. Historically, space debris policy has been backward looking, and it takes lessons lived, if you will, and applies those into policy. And we haven't had policy very long. It was really initiated in the Reagan administration, and each subsequent administration since has put their puts and takes and expanded on that, kind of adjusting to what we learn and live on a daily basis in orbit. So I think as we move forward, we're starting to see, potential for more congestion, and it's time to be leaning forward, more forward-leaning into our policy rather than, waiting for something to happen and then reacting to it.
So I want to tie that into, thank you for that. Our next topic, which is space traffic management, which is sort of the evolution of this. As you mentioned, we've, historically been thinking about space debris as, doing disposal for single satellites and sort of managing the historical amount of debris. But we're now entering an era where there are plans for tens of thousands of new satellites and very large constellations, which may call for, as you kind of put it, a more proactive approach to this, which is sort of come under the blanket term of space traffic management. So Pierre, I wonder if you could introduce to us sort of the term space traffic management and sort of how you're thinking about this from the Commission.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. You see, we are talking about space, high technology, and we are not able to have microphone working, but we are much more efficient in space than in microphones, obviously. I'm relatively new to the space world, and when I joined this beautiful world, I had the feeling that space actually is full of stars, full of planets, but as well relatively empty. And actually, I've realized that you have a lot of satellites, actually many more satellites than people in this room, turning around, orbiting around planet Earth. Actually, if you want to have a good idea of the number of satellites which are orbiting now around space, look at all the chairs in this room. It's approximately the number of satellites which are orbiting for the moment around planet Earth. So that gives you quite an impressive way, knowing, of course, that not all orbits are free, so you cannot go anywhere in space. Some orbits are more interesting than others. So look at all those chairs and imagine those are satellites for the moment. But if we come back in a few months, in a few years' times, it will be many more chairs which will be needed to give you an indication of the number of satellites orbiting around space. So that's the first element. Second element, why do we have so many satellites in space? Not because they are nice objects. I'm not an engineer. Engineers love the satellites for the satellites. But being a lawyer and working for an economic organization, we love the satellites for all the economic benefits they bring to us, for all the economic advantages which are brought to us by satellites. And so we are building, our economy is being built around satellites. Already now, we have made the calculation that about 10% of our GDP everywhere, at least in the US, in Europe, and many countries, 10% of the GDP is based on satellite, even if you don't realize it now. And this figure will continue to grow. So satellites are not only beautiful technological objects, they are extremely important from an economic point of view. Now, if you combine what has been said and what you have said also in the past, you have already a lot of satellites. Satellites are important from an economic point of view, and we will have more and more satellites being launched. The two are linked, of course, because satellites are important from an economic point of view. What are we going to do? And that's the issue of space traffic management. And this issue of space traffic management is basically about the fundamental question, do we leave a complete freedom to everybody to do anything with satellites, or do we try to organize a bit the way you launch satellites in space? And again, this question was not there a few years ago because we didn't have so many satellites. But now that we are having more satellites in space and even more to be launched in the near future, this is becoming a fundamental question. We don't have a magic solution, of course. Nobody has a magic solution now. But I would say maybe a few points. First of all, it's not only in the US that satellites are being launched. Satellites are being launched from everywhere in the world. In Europe, in Asia, everywhere in Latin America, everywhere in Africa, everywhere you have satellites being launched. So that triggers for us, Europeans, at least one answer, that the solution to this problem should be an international one. Nobody can actually regulate and rule on the access to space for everybody in the world. So we need to find international solutions. That's the first message I would like to convey to you. The second message I would like to convey to you is the fact that, of course, at this stage, we certainly do not need to have heavy regulations because it's a new industry and we cannot stifle innovation by putting too many regulations on it. So we need to be careful on what we do. Again, I don't have a magic solution, but certainly the dimension that it's a new industry is fundamental. Third dimension, and I've seen one question also, third dimension, space is not only occupied by civil satellites, but also by military satellites. And so we will have to see how do we cope with this dual dimension. On one side, military dimension, which is fundamental for those countries launching satellites in space, and they don't like the idea, of course, of being regulated by someone else, and civil satellites. How do we combine both? It's something which will be a very difficult issue. But even if I don't have the solution now, I'm an old man, but not that old. But I remember that at one point you were free to fly airplanes without any rules at the beginning of aviation. And progressively, because we had more and more airplanes, some rules were introduced and have become international regulation and standards. I don't see why it would not be possible to have a similar evolution with the satellites and also to introduce some kind of space traffic manager progressively, slowly, not stifling innovation, but making sure that we have an international dimension also to this issue. I would stop here before the micro stop.
Great, thank you very much. So you mentioned that space traffic management, we think about it as how do we manage the emerging civil and commercial uses of space and activities. Mark, I want to turn to you now and bring up our next big topic, which is military activities in space and competition. And so can you talk a little bit about the major policy issues there and maybe what the industry perspective is on that?
Yes, thanks, Brian. Oh, my micro is working. That's great. Well, thanks for having me at this panel. Of course, for us visiting from Europe, this is very exciting to be here in the US to get the new trends of the industry. And I can tell you the last days have really been very helpful to get an idea where especially the exploration is going. Yeah, if you talk about global space policy and national security, obviously, first of all, national security is in most ways a domestic issue. So there is not a global policy around national security. A lot of talk about organizational questions in the different countries, space forces, or what type of organization there is. And of course, regulatory sets, as Pierre was saying, with regard to frequency, but also space traffic management, are not applying to the national security domain. So I think this is an issue where global space policy will have a very limited role for industry. De facto, everybody's looking to his own governments there and see how the markets evolve and what the rules are. And obviously, there's still a very strong binational or for us by German, for others by American reality as it is in national security items. But the other point you're mentioning in terms of the competition, the space policy for competition, of course, the more that our industry becomes driven by commercial rules, commercial players, that is becoming more and more significant. Of course, we are heading to a world where the WTO rules will apply. We might see issues like we saw on aircraft, commercial aircraft with Airbus and Boeing coming. From a European perspective, I'm sure many of you have already heard that there are complaints in Europe about pricing for launch services in terms of a competitive issue. Is this something, is this a level playing field, or how are we dealing about the issue of level playing field for certain space-related services? And this requires, of course, policies to be developed. And I guess it will start the more we go into a commercially driven world. We will see those policies hopefully evolving. Again, industry needs a clear set of rules, of boundary conditions. So in that respect, I guess industry is benefiting from that in order to help the global commerce or the international commerce to take a larger role in space. So we're looking forward to that, hoping that it will end up with open market regimes.
Yeah, so thank you for that. I want a follow-up question for anyone on the panel who would like to answer it. We have a question here from the audience about concern about space becoming increasingly militarized. And they ask, what are the important red lines for military operations? I'll change that a little bit and say, is there concern from industry that the rhetoric about conflict and warfighting in space, or the opportunity for war in space, is a potential hindrance for commercial activity? Is there a concern from commercial side on that? And what can the industry do to play a role in those discussions?
Well, obviously it's both. I mean, yes, of course, if you think about the space debris issue, it is an issue that, of course, military interventions can be very, very harmful to the whole space industry or the whole space commerce. But on the other hand, we have to also keep in mind that military is a very, very significant customer to the space industry. I guess for that issue, from an industry perspective, it's not to set red lines from the private sector. We are following that, I guess, in all the countries over the world. We're following that more as a service to our governments and as a potential market, and we hope that on a government level policies will be developed.
Pierre?
Yeah, maybe not really as a follow-up, but I would like maybe to insist on something else which is indirectly linked to the questions. Militarization of space is one aspect. But when we talk about the importance of commercial, of civil space for our economy, it means also that this space could be subject to cyber attack. And so the issue of cyber security in space is for me something which is fundamental. Maybe not yet so well perceived, because again, that was the idea, we go out, we move quickly and so on. But again, if we don't put into place the appropriate mechanism, we might have real consequences on the ground. I give you a very concrete example. We are operating a system which is called Copernicus. Copernicus is Earth observation. Earth observation, those data are free and available for everybody. Okay. Why are they free and available for everybody? Because we want everybody to be in a position to use those data to create new services, new applications, to provide indication, to provide information. If Copernicus is the subject of a cyber attack, what will be the consequences on thousands, maybe millions of people? So the issue of cybersecurity, mitigation is one aspect, but cyber attacks and the protection of assets in space from a cyber attack is something which is extremely important and probably will be even more important in the future.
So, Kayue, I want to turn to you now and introduce the other major topic we want to talk about this morning, and that's the issue of resource utilization, which is talked about as asteroid mining or using moon regolith for things. Basically, what can we do about using these resources that are in space? So, Kayue, could you please give us an overview of that subject?
Thank you, Brian. There was a question on which topic does nightmares to you. Actually, the resource topic does not give me nightmares, at least not yet. Maybe nightmares every second night. What is really giving me nightmares, and I would, if you allow, very briefly return to that, is space traffic management. Pierre indicated that there is no solution yet. I have to object to that. The International Institute of Space Law, which I'm representing, has from 50 countries more than 500 members. So that means that we have at least around 600 different solutions for that. And it is indeed an issue which requires our full attention, the attention of the policymakers, of the lawmakers, of the regulators. And it is not an easy task, because you cannot simply set up a space traffic management in an environment which has so far been characterized by a legal regime which is just focusing on the status of outer space and the status of the actors. But space traffic management is completely different. It is about the behavior of the actors. And this requires an enormous effort, a new thinking of how to approach it, also new governance mechanisms and new implementing mechanisms, new institutional mechanisms in order to get a hand on that. And this is an effort we have been actually working on already in conceptualizing it, but it will be a political task, and all the governments are called upon to look into that. Now let me return and answer to your question, the resource issue. You are all aware of the potential, the possibilities, and also the substance of what is going on, so I don't have to go into that. It is simply the next big thing. It has huge economic and societal impacts. It has potential impacts on the energy supply of the Earth. It has simply a game-changing relevance. Now, returning to the lawyers, I'm pretty sure this crowd here is equally separated. When I say that it is important to have a stable and reliable framework for doing resource mining, for handling the resources, then half of you will say, thank God we have the lawyers who will provide that to us, and the other half will say, my God, the lawyers, they will spoil everything. Now, I don't know whether the truth is in between, but it is indeed necessary to think about that ahead, but thinking about that on the basis of what we already have. And I would like to remind you that outer space is a global common. A global common means that it's not open for appropriation, national appropriation. This basic principle enshrined in the Outer Space Treaty is really something we should cherish, because it provides us with the opportunity to set up regulation and then a form of handling resource mining which is not only efficient and serves a kind of first come, first served, the first gets the most, but it also provides us with the opportunity to create a fair and inclusive way of managing the resources in outer space. And this is something which we all are called upon, not to allow first-comers just to grab, but to think ahead and to keep outer space, what it is also from its principle and its spirit, something for all humankind and for a fair and equitable solution to deal with its resources. Thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer, I was wondering, do you have, you work both on the, not only the spectrum we started with, but also the space traffic management and a little bit of the resource issue. There's a question in here about, are we going to see flags of convenience in the future? In other words, say a certain country puts in place a space traffic management regime or resource utilization rules. How would you think that would affect things? Is that a possibility, this flags convenience thing?
So let's see, is this working? Great. So we saw flags of convenience in the past with satellites, satellite registrations under the ITU. I'll call it flags of convenience, where where companies would file perhaps speculative applications. But the space community came together and created rules of the road that the ITU enforced that really reduced that. And we don't see that in the same way that we saw that 15 years ago. And so the community tends to come together when it sees an abuse, a perceived abuse of the environment, whether it's the regulatory environment, an unregulated environment, to bring regulation. I think, and it's very interesting as I'm listening to Kayove, I find myself transported to conversations that take place in the law of the sea with respect to resourcing critical minerals from international waters, international, deep seabed ocean. And they're very similar conversations. And there are lessons to be learned from that nascent industry, and how do we find guiding principles from that help guide an even more nascent industry in the space realm.
And that's actually a point, because oftentimes not only law of the sea and maritime law, but also aviation law are often used as analogies for space law. And while there is some lessons you probably learn there, space is inherently different, as Kai pointed out, has its own set of international laws that have a little bit of differences between things that happen in air and maritime. A question in here that I'll open up to anybody, and that is, if there is a new regime or a new policy on a particular aspect of this, who enforces those? And is that done just at the national level? Is there any international enforcement? Is anybody wants to comment on?
Thank you, Brian. This question is a real nightmare indeed, how to handle that and how to come to that. International law and international relations do not know that, except for cases when the UN Security Council indeed is the world police, if I may say so. But we don't have that in outer space. And at this stage, it's good that we do not have that, because we have also a community, and the governments actually come together and find ways and means in cases where there is a problem, sit down in fora like ITU, like UN Corpus, and try to remedy that. However, when we are entering negotiations and conceptualization of space traffic management, we will have to have rules for certainly conflict resolution, because there will be conflicts, and also enforcement. We will also have to find ways and means to have the actors, I don't say the countries, but there will be actors, to abide by the rules. So there have to be sanction mechanisms. It does not necessarily have to be a police car in outer space who takes the satellites out and gives them a ticket. But we will have to find ways and means, and the governments have to accept to limit their sovereignty in order then to really ensure that space traffic management works.
Could I just add to that, which is if you look at the ITU, it has very little enforcement authority. Yet the principle of comity really has a disciplining effect, because tomorrow you may be in the position of the entity that needs some sort of support today or action today. So it's not that you become empathetic, but you realize that you too may be in that position, so you become more accommodating and cooperative. I think that's important. That's not to take away from what Kaiue said about needing rules and regulations, because investments do like to have certainty of what an environment is going to be, security of title, investment security, and all of that benefits not only current investors, but the future flow of investment. I mean, VC and angels look at that too. It's not just big companies.
No, just to be a little bit provocative. I know that the space world believe and consider itself to be completely different from the rest of the world. Completely different from the rest of other space, other sectors, and so on.
We're special.
I know that's the perception, and that's why I say it's a little bit provocative. It's true, of course, that you have a certain number of features in the space sector which do not exist elsewhere. But again, I don't see why solutions which have worked for other sectors will not work at one point also for the space sector. So the real question is simply, when are we going to reach this point where we need to go to this, towards this? And that's the point which we are discussing. Not now, but still we cannot ignore that space is no longer the special sector which existed maybe a few years ago. Things are different now. We have mega constellations which are coming. Space is fundamental for our economy. So we cannot simply, and you have more and more space nations, I would say, so we cannot ignore this. And we need to take that into account in the way we devise things for the future.
So we have a couple minutes left here. I want to address, there's a question here that's the most highly voted question we have yet asked, and that is, what role does the public have in space policy issues, and how can we, the policy people, engage the public on these issues? I was wondering if anybody has any thoughts on that. I mean, some of it can be difficult because some of these issues, let's say the ITU spectrum, are so technically and legally complex, but also the public is affected by the decisions that are made there. So any thoughts on this?
Just maybe as a follow-up to what just I said, and then I stop because I've spoken too much on this panel. The first message is maybe we should reach outside of the space sector. Because and that's the problem with the space sector. The perception is the space sector is special and talk to himself a lot. I love this kind of conferences, it's nice to meet you here, meet the same people in Colorado Springs, and just we turn around the world. But what is even more important is just to reach out, to talk to outside the space sector. And because what they believe about it is fundamental, because they are also dependent upon the space sector. So my message would be, yes, certainly we need to talk to the public, but the public not meaning the specialist of the space sector. The public should be everybody. We should talk to everybody, first of all, to explain the importance of space, because not everybody is aware of the importance of space, but also to listen to the rest of the world. And I stop now.
I would add to that, I think it's really important to engage with universities and high schools, not only to try and inspire the next generation of space, but to inspire those to understand the importance of space to non-space, people who don't view themselves as part of the space community, so they become appreciative of it. As appreciative as you are of your smartphone, to be as appreciative of the importance of space policy to your everyday life. And I don't think the space policy community has done that enough. We tend to try and grow our own, I agree with Pierre, and talk to ourselves. We need to do a better job collectively of that kind of education, not with the desire only of creating a stronger space workforce, but a stronger space community. Thank you.
The European Commission and ESA have been doing surveys or participatory actions, which are extremely valuable. I think of your surveys, which are super valuable in understanding what the public thinks, what their concerns are, what their dreams and their inspirations and aspirations are. And a community like ours, the lawyers, are listening and looking very carefully and attentively to such surveys and to participatory activities in order then to understand the real concerns of the public and the citizens, and then also to find solutions which are acceptable. Very few of our members are only space lawyers. They have broader fields of law or policies. And they are in contact with a lot of students from various areas, from various countries, and from various backgrounds. So we are constantly enriched by various views of the public in order then to be able to respond also to the concerns of the citizens.
Well, thank you. And with that, I'm afraid to say that I think our grand tour has come to an end as we've reached our time limit. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their remarks.